Well, we want to welcome everyone again to a special Determined Truth live stream as we continue our conversation on Israel, Gaza, and the larger Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's a number of reasons why we're doing this so quickly here on a Saturday night, some of which will become evident as we proceed. This live stream is being sponsored by Determined Truth, as well as the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, Peace Catalyst, and the Christian Forum on Israel-Palestine. We'll just try to discuss each of those organizations as we proceed. But at Determined Truth, we've hosted more than 30 live streams since the terror attack of October 7th and the outbreak of the war on Gaza. We've published numerous blogs discussing the church's role and the need to advocate for a just peace for the sake of everyone. All of these can be accessed on the Determined Truth website. Let me put that banner up right here now. At determinedtruth.com. Go to the blog tab or the YouTube tab. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you're automatically notified of upcoming events. So when we have one, as quickly as we put this one together, you'll be notified automatically. You know, the tragedy of October 7th became, for Israel, became a nightmare for Gaza. There are now more than 40,000 people, Gazans dead, 90,000 or more injured, another 10,000 are missing and presumed dead. There's now an outbreak of polio. More than 100 hostages have yet to be released, and their survival is still even in question. And the world's attention has been, for the past 11 months, understandably focusing on Gaza. But there have been warnings that things are not well in the West Bank. Prior to the attack of October 7th, 2023 was already the deadliest year on record for the Palestinians in the West Bank. And unfortunately, extremist elements in the Netanyahu government have seized the opportunity to have the focus on Gaza to increase violent activity in the West Bank. The number of Palestinians in the West Bank that are being detained in Israeli prisons has more than doubled in the past year. Reports of torture and sexual violence have been widespread. Christian Forum on Israel-Palestine did an interview with Munther Amira. We encourage you to go watch that, but be careful and be forewarned that some of that is explicit and not meant for children. There's also been a significant increase in settler violence against the Palestinians. The Israeli government has been providing weapons. Let me see if I can do two things at the same time here and bring this up here. Here we go. There you go. Has been providing. This is Itamar Ben-Gvir, an extremist member of Netanyahu's cabinet, and is in charge of the national security, handing out assault weapons in October of 2023. This is October, just after October 7th. And 2023, of course, about a month later, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz issued this article saying, I don't know if can you see it or not here? I'm making sure I got the right screen. Nope, let me share my screen. I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to, there we go. There we go. Haaretz issued this article saying Israel's top cop warns that Ben-Gvir's mass distribution of weapons could put them in the wrong hands. And unfortunately, that is exactly what's been happening since October 7th. So this has been just horrible conditions. And so today, what we're going to do is we're going to bring along Ben Norquist of Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, as well as Mercy Aiken, who also works with the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East and Peace Catalyst, to kind of discuss what's going on. Mercy just returned from the West Bank, so we want to especially hear from her and her firsthand experiences. So Mercy and Ben, thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right. We should note before we go any further, we hopefully have made this clear that some of Mercy's experiences and the stories she's going to tell potentially are not meant for children. And some of you might even find some of these stories disturbing, but that gives you an idea in terms of what's going on. So let's begin, Ben, with yourself. Kind of tell us a little bit about NEME, what NEME is, and your work with NEME and what's going on there.
Sure. Sounds good. Thanks, Rob. Really appreciate it. Yep. So I'm the director of the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, or NEME, as we've been calling it, which is a collective of Christians, evangelical Christians, and just sort of everyday Christians and pastors and students and scholars as well, working together as followers of Jesus towards justice and peace. And we're pursuing holistic approaches to resolutions to the conflict in the Middle East. And we're just very sensitive to the sometimes detrimental ways that, American Christians and the evangelical church in the United States has been involved in the Middle East in the past. And we're committed to finding and following a better way that promotes peace, justice, safety for all in the Middle East. So we do that in some different ways. We host educational conversations, much like this one, and one that we'll invite listeners tonight to, that's coming up on Tuesday as well. We'll make that invitation at the end of this discussion. We're also publishing a curriculum here, actually just in a couple of weeks, that's designed for churches and homeschool families to learn more about the Middle East, both sort of ancient and theological perspectives, and to better understand what's happening modern day. And that was authored principally by one of our leadership team at NEME, Bruce Fisk. So we're very excited about that coming out in just a couple of weeks. And increasingly, we're working with evangelical institutions as well, directly partnering with institutions to help them in their own institutional journey towards standing on the side of holistic peace for the Middle East. So just quickly, I came to this work through a long personal journey myself. But we'll suffice it to say that I did my PhD work in Palestine, and I met a group of Palestinian evangelicals in the course of my research. I got to know them, and they were talking about the Bible and about God in ways that I had never heard before, that were vivid and alive and prophetic. And they embodied Jesus' call to love your enemies in ways that I had never seen, and that changed me. And so, that led to the work that I'm doing now, and really, really glad to be involved in it, and appreciate being invited here onto this live stream.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. So, Mercy, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your work with NEME and Peace Catalyst and your role with both of these organizations.
Thanks so much, Rob. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, really wonderful to be with both of you today. I've worked with NEME for the past few years as the relationship manager. So Ben explained a lot about what we're doing. My role has really been to connect and invite people into the network. So consider yourself invited once again by me. And Peace Catalyst is an organization that I'm currently transitioning to. I'm planning to move to Egypt early next year. The Lord has really called me to the Middle East. It is the area that He has put on my heart, particularly Israel, Palestine. And I'm going to position myself in Cairo to be available for a lot of the refugees. There's already between 100,000 to 200,000 Gazan refugees that are in Cairo. And that number could be very different, a lot bigger, perhaps by early next year when I plan to be over there. So that's one of the things I'm doing. We're also putting together immersion programs for people to come and learn about the lay of the land through Peace Catalyst, and a lot of other good stuff that we're doing. So you can learn about it at peacecatalyst.org. Okay,
and we'll get all that information. We'll put all the links for all that in the comments box on the YouTube channel when this goes live. When this is, I'll finish it there as well. So Mercy, and by the way, if you're watching us live, we want to thank you for joining us. And there is a comments box. Feel free to add some comments there. We'll do our best to get to them. We have a lot on our agenda today, and if we can get to them, we will. But we appreciate your comments there as well. So Mercy, you just came back from the West Bank. How long was your trip? Why did you travel there? Tell us a little bit, kind of give us the context of that trip and what's going on.
Yeah. I was invited to be a part of a special delegation. It's kind of being put together through several organizations. One of them is Sabeel. It's a Palestinian Liberation Theology organization, which some of you may be familiar with. And then there's some other Christians for Ceasefire, Pax Christi. So it was kind of a grouping of several different organizations working together. And I was invited as an evangelical to be a part of this group of religious leaders. Most of them on this delegation were from Catholic and Methodist and other traditions like that. But our invitation was to come and see what is actually happening on the ground in the West Bank, which has been, people just are not paying enough attention to what's happening, and the reality on the ground is shifting so fast. I feel like it's changing, from day to day. Even after we've left, things have changed a lot. So we were invited to come and to bear witness, to come to some of these areas of hot spots, to come to some of these areas where there's no international presence and settlers are doing basically whatever they want. Also, we wanted to show solidarity and support for all the people who are suffering, including Israelis. So we spent some time visiting, like with hostage families, or we attempted to do so.
Wow.
So it was really there to learn and to show loving support as witnesses of Christ, and to even be like a nonviolent presence that might interrupt the flow of violence where it's taking place, to actually be internationals, putting our bodies in the way of the flow of some of the things that have just been happening without hindrance. So we were there for just a week, but it was a very intense week. We covered a lot of ground, and I'll be able to talk about just some of it today. There's no way I could even talk about everything that we did.
So, yeah, and I just want to, just by way of further framing this discussion that we're having with Mercy, and kind of giving some context for how we came to the decision that we needed to offer this conversation. Mercy, as a part of the NEME leadership team, we were just meeting as a team, and actually Rob is on that team as well. So we know each other through NEME and from other circles. So just the other day during our leadership team meeting, we opened by asking Mercy if she would share a brief update with us, just internal to the NEME leadership team, about what she saw when she had just recently gotten back. I think she was still recovering from jet lag, if I remember correctly. And what she shared floored us. And there were tears, and we didn't know what to say. We didn't, people talked about feeling undone. I had an agenda, and we set that aside because what happened, what we heard her share, it created a new set of priorities for us in that moment. And one of the things that came out of that conversation that ensued was, this is something that is critically important for us to share, and to share quickly. So
share now.
To share now. Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Rob. So Mercy, I just wanted to ask, as we dig further into sharing about what you saw, what you saw are the kinds of things that we don't hear about in the news. And I wanted to ask you, Palestinians in the West Bank have always lived with vulnerability of various kinds. But as Rob alluded to at the opening, the situation seems right now to be careening out of control. It's just, it's hard to imagine what all is happening in the West Bank right now. And I wonder if you could provide some context for what's happening there.
Yeah. Well, since October 7th, about 5,500 residents of Israeli settlements have been recruited into these special military units or battalions, like basically battalions that are sanctioned by the government. And as Rob was talking about, they have been armed. There's even been some laws that have basically given them as much authority, or maybe even more than the IDF in some places. It's not even really clear. I think it's all kind of maybe intentionally obscure, but they're very, very emboldened to go far beyond where they used to. I've spent a lot of time in the occupied Palestinian territory, so I'm very familiar with the kind of daily grind of the vulnerability that Palestinians experience. But right now, because of the war, there's virtually no international presence in the West Bank anywhere. And it has been international presence until now that has provided a little bit of a buffer and a little bit of security for the people who are most vulnerable. The people who are most vulnerable are those who live closest to settlements, or on land that settlers want. So this is going to be mostly in Area C of the West Bank. I think you said you might have a map of that, Rob, if you want to pull that up. For those who don't know, the West Bank is divided into 3 sections as part of the Oslo process that has been stalled now for 20 years. But Area C is the vast majority of the West Bank. This is area that is under Israeli control. It was supposed to be handed over to Palestinians in increments, but it never has been. In fact, settlers have just been moving into it more and more. So the Palestinians who live in this area, basically the white.
The yellow is Area C. The Palestinians live in the white, correct?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's the vast majority of the West Bank. Where you see the little dots, those are areas where Palestinians have a little bit more authority. So the Palestinians that live basically out in the country where the settlers are being built, though this is one of the places where they are just the most vulnerable. And I've never seen them so vulnerable. And I was shocked myself, who's seen a lot. I was shocked at the level of impunity that the settlers are operating under and the things that they're doing and just completely getting away with it, apart from maybe a minor slap on the wrist from time to time if an incident makes international news. And I'll just say, everyone always talks about Israeli security, and Lord knows we want the Israelis to be secure, but I think it's time to start talking about Palestinian security as well. It's way past time to start talking about Palestinian security. They are also very vulnerable, and there is no protection for them. They cannot even protect themselves. If they protect themselves, they will be killed or arrested. There's basically nothing they can do except try to run.
Right. Mercy, just to frame the conversation for everyone's sake, settlements are Israeli citizens that have been moved into the West Bank since 1967, when Israel became the occupying force in the West Bank. Within 3 months of that, they began building settlements, their own citizens, their own people that have massive structures, entire cities that are built in these areas. There are now 750,000 Israelis that live in the West Bank. And Ben Gvir has been arming a lot of them. Some of them are just economic settlers. They just live there because it's cheap housing. But some of them are radical settlers. And they are radical settlers who believe this is our land and we want the Palestinians out. And they're seizing, if I'm not mistaken, Mercy, they're seizing this opportunity of the focus on Gaza to take the violence there. And now you're telling us that the Israeli government's been arming them and enlisting them into special forces there. So can you give us some more of the stories and things that you experienced then in the West Bank and some of the Bedouin village I think you were telling us about a little bit more, and tell us some of the stories there.
Yeah. So since October 7th, about 30 such villages have been forcibly depopulated. And so while we were there, one of the days, we had actually something else scheduled, but we were stuck at this long checkpoint. And so we just made this decision to switch courses after we made it through the checkpoint and go visit this Bedouin village called Jamal that we heard was being depopulated at that very moment, that the villagers were packing up and moving. And because they had experienced such terror attacks from settlers just over the past week. Now they had been experiencing a lot more since October 7th, but the past week alone had become so unbearable for them that they had said, fine, we're packing up to leave. So we drove out to this area I'd never been before. It was in the Jordanian Valley somewhere. I'm not even exactly sure where it was.
The Jordan River Valley, you mean by that, right?
Jordan River Valley. But as we were driving along, I saw Israeli flags just draped all over the place, like new settlements, new outposts that were going up. There were road signs, normally which are in Arabic, Hebrew, and English, letting people know directions to certain villages. And you would often see those road signs with blue spray paint over the Arabic language, letting people know where whatever that village was, or maybe that was a village that had been depopulated, so they sprayed it out, and there were stars of David sprayed on the road signs in those places. There were like barren hilltops that just had like an Israeli flag planted on it, like the moon, so this is what we're driving through as we get to this village. So we pull off by the side of the road, and most of us, there were a few of our delegation who stayed inside our little bus van because the walk was a little more than they wanted to do. And some of them were Palestinians, but most of us went on out to the village. Out there, we found an amazing, really tough Israeli woman who had been staying out there with this village and other villages in the area, trying to be that protective presence that is no longer provided by internationals. There were actually 2 Israelis out there, kind of sunburned, and they'd been just staying out there. When we got to the village, the women and children were already gone. the men were packing up what was left of their village. And they told us that there was a spring nearby. This new settlement was coming in, and they were blocking their access to the spring. This was a village that had a lot of cows and had a lot of sheep. Unlike a lot of Bedouin villages that you might see, they actually had houses, like kind of built more like caravan style. They had little fruit trees that they had planted. There were about 100 people that lived in this village, but they said they had been so terrorized, they'd not been able to get access to their water, to their spring. Their animals were being attacked. Settlers were coming like right into their house, just like walking in with sticks and like beating them. There were reports that women like in the bathroom would look up and see like a face of a settler like leering in. Very modest culture, very, very, very terrifying. I don't know what they were doing in the bathroom, where, what might have even been exposed. But the basically like the chief of the village, he said, I can handle, anything for myself. But when my children are throwing up because they're so frightened and they can't sleep at night, he said, we haven't even been able to go to sleep at night. We're afraid to go to sleep because they come in the middle of the night and wake us up. They wake us up at midnight. They wake us up at 2 a.m. They wake us up at 4 a.m. They keep attacking us. So we're leaving. So the women and children were gone. They were packing up the feed. The whole village was like in a state of like half there, half packed up. So while we were there learning the story, the Israeli military came up and they told us that we had to leave, that we were not allowed to be there. The Israeli woman who was out there went, she was arguing fiercely with the soldiers. And we were trying to decide what to do, because after hearing all this, we were more afraid that if we leave now, there might even be a higher like vengeance attack on this village, because this large group of internationals showed up. We could see some of the settlers actually driving around on like ATVs, like in the distance, you could see them zooming over the hills. Teenagers, most of these are young men, like they are, some of them may not even be eligible yet to be in the IDF. I don't know why they weren't in the IDF. I would assume they were maybe younger, or maybe they're part of these new militias that Ben Gvir set up. So I'm not really sure what the status of them was. So we stayed there after the IDF told us to leave. We stayed longer, and then finally we thought we probably better just leave. Probably the best thing that we can do as internationals is go back to our hotel in Jerusalem and write to the State Department and write to the US Embassy and write to as many places as we can and let them know what we just witnessed, and demand that there is accountability and that there is some kind of international awareness of what is happening with this village, Jamal. So that was kind of what made it bearable actually for us to leave, because it's like, okay, we have something else that we can do using our US privilege. So as we went back to our bus, like where the bus had dropped us off, it was no longer there. So we called them, and they said, while you guys were out there, some settlers came up and were like driving around the bus and like terrified them, so that they started inching away, and the settlers were basically chasing them. So and because there were mostly Palestinians in the bus, they were very, very frightened. So they drove around and then kind of came back, and they were quite shaken up as well. So that was kind of the story with Jamal. We found out afterwards that everything was quiet that night, and we hope it was because of our advocacy.
Right.
Because we stayed up for several hours. We all wrote letters, like we wanted to kind of inundate. But since then, I've heard, in the days following, as they were still packing up, there has been continued to be attacks upon the men of that village as they're getting the rest of it taken up and moved several miles down the road, where they're joining another Bedouin village, which will probably also be attacked shortly.
Mercy, thanks for sharing that. And for listeners, I just want to point out, just to help connect some of the dots, it may or may not be the case that the settlers in this story were armed by Ben Gvir. But
Right.
whether they were or not, that's the kind of person that we're talking about are receiving this kind of weaponry from the Israeli government.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it's all the more terrifying to imagine that kind of a story with like where assault rifles like the one that we saw the picture of are in the mix.
Right.
It's
And
terrifying.
I would just add that the day before we went out to this village is when a group of about 100 settlers, along with the IDF, went into this village of Jit, which is nearby. And this actually made international news because they lit a bunch of cars on fire. A young man was killed. It was a very well coordinated attack with all kinds of assault weapons, even rifles and like tear gas and pepper spray, and IDF soldiers with the settlers and protecting the settlers, or settlers in IDF uniforms. Again, we don't necessarily quite know what all was going on. But I think this village in particular was really frightened. Like the whole area was very, very frightened because of what had just happened the day before with the village of Jit. And numerous other ones that I could mention, but I won't take up time. But, you know, just over the past like day or two before they packed up and moved, there were numerous other attacks, you know, in other villages, sheep and animals even being stolen. 300 sheep were stolen at another village the day before near Jericho, things like that. So it's just across the entire West Bank.
Thanks, Mercy. I wanted to ask you about a family that many of us know and love. The Nasser family, Daoud Nasser and his family. They're a Palestinian Christian family and farmers, and they've been farming the same plot of land for generations upon generations, and in fact have paperwork that they're proud to show that proves that they've been on that plot of land and owning it and farming it since the Ottoman Empire. And Daoud Nasser, if you ever spend even just a few minutes with him, there's an immediate connection and affinity and affection because he channels the nonviolence of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi, and he is a modern version of the Palestinian version, and he's so inspiring and so charming and tenderhearted and kind and vulnerable, like we've been talking about.
Yes.
And Mercy, I just wondered, I think I had heard that you'd maybe have some updates for us about how the Nassers are doing, how the farm is. It's on this hilltop that's surrounded by settlements just south of Bethlehem. And those settlements have been getting bigger and bigger and growing closer and closer for years, and things seem to be reaching a breaking point. So, any updates about the Nassers?
Yeah. Well, certainly in the past, they've had like many of their hundreds of trees uprooted. They've had settlers that have come in with guns and tried to force them off the property. And they've lived under this motto, "We refuse to be enemies," which they have painted at the front of their property, which is really beautiful. I've been out there many times, but never has it taken so long to get to their property. We had to take this really long back road. Like we used to have to park at this area where the settlers blocked the road, and then we would walk over these big boulders and walk down to their property. You can't do that anymore. That is completely off limits for them. And this other road that they used to use to access their property is also blocked. So now you have to go way around. It took way longer. It's never taken so long to get out to the property. And one of the first things that struck me when I saw them was just how tired they looked.
Yeah.
I had never seen Daoud look quite so fatigued as I did. And that really broke my heart to see that. They talked, as everyone that we met said, we feel so vulnerable. We feel so isolated. We feel lonely because people can't, it's hard for us to get out. It's hard for them to get in. We feel cut off from our own community. We feel cut off from the international supporters that we used to have. We are surrounded by hostile settlers. And one thing that the settlers had just done was I don't know if it was a new road. I couldn't quite understand it, but there was this road on their property that they're that they're no longer now allowed to drive on. And there was a caravan, like the beginning of a new settlement. That's how they start a new settlement. They'll put a caravan, a trailer, something in an area marking like this is where we're building a new settlement. It was just, I mean, right next to another settlement that was right there, but like right through the fence, through their like chicken wire fence, there's this big, huge caravan right there. Very, very, very ominous for them. They have been appealing to the Supreme Court and about this new road and that they can't get on it. And then the Supreme Court said, this sounds like this is a legal dispute between you and individuals. So they put it into some other court. So this is a different court date from the September one coming up. This one is in October, where they're going to figure out what's going on with the road. So basically what they were saying is like, we feel that we're going to be cut off from the rest of Bethlehem, like the way that the separation wall is being built and the settlements, like we are going to end up being cut off from Bethlehem, which is our community. It's where they go to church. It's where a lot of their families live. And we're going to be stuck here in the middle of this settlement, this whole settlement that's like a ring around them. They were basically just begging, like, we need more international support. We need more internationals to come out here. When there's even just one international on the property with us, the attacks lessen. And when we'd gotten out there, there were 2 women from Northern Europe, I forget which country, that had just arrived. So they were really, really grateful to have these women there. But that was one of the appeals that Daoud, and I'll just echo it for anyone listening, if you feel a stirring in your heart to go out there and just be a protective presence and live on the property with the Nassers, they would really, really appreciate that right now, because they are so isolated and so vulnerable. And what's the way things are shifting right now, they're hanging on by a thread, but they're determined to hang on and not give up. So that's kind of where they are right now.
Wow. And for those of you who watch on the Determined Truth blog site, I encourage you to just click on any blog, and that'll take you to a Patheo site. And on the Patheo site, there's an archives tab. And under the archives tab, you can choose a subject, Daoud Nassar. I've written several blogs on Daoud. He's one of the men that I think of the story of Stephen, that his face looked like that of an angel when he was arguing with the Apostle Paul, when he was arguing with the Jews in Acts chapter 6. This is what unbelievable Christian man. If those of you guys that have been there, you've worshiped with him in the caves, and that is as close to heaven as you're ever going to get this side of eternity. So Mercy, we talked already about the settlements a little bit, but you had another experience with a Bedouin village that actually has been declared Al-Makuri, designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014. So the Cassia family, I think it is, in the Makur Valley. So can you tell us about that? Yeah,
that's actually not a Bedouin village. This is an area that's right outside of Bethlehem. It's area that has just been Christian land, like outside of Beit Jala. And so and there's this beautiful village from Beit Jala, like you can walk down through the olive groves and you can walk to this little village called Batir, which is part of the World UNESCO Heritage Site because of these ancient terraces and these old Roman waterways that are still in use. And the village is just this beautiful, quiet little farming village. It's the last green space in Bethlehem. So it's the last place where Bethlehemites, if you want to get out of the very, very crowded municipality of Bethlehem, you have to realize that almost all of their green spaces have already been cut off and confiscated by the separation wall, by new settlements, by settlement roads, by, settlement areas, by military firing zones, whatever. And so this is pretty much the only green place left that they can go, an area that used to be fully surrounded by, groves and just beautiful countryside. And now this area is also under extreme threat. While we were there, I think it was Peace Now, which is an Israeli organization that sort of keeps tracks of settlements. They released the boundary lines of this new settlement that had just been legally approved by the Netanyahu government. to build right in this area. And so there's this Christian family, the Casilla family. They had a restaurant there. I remember it when I used to live over there. It was demolished in 2019. And the Casilla family, though they have the property, they have the papers showing this is our land. It's completely legal. They are actually citizens of Israel, at least some of the family, although they live in the West Bank. So there's absolutely no legality for like the demolition of the restaurant. But then on July 31st, just a few weeks before we arrived, settlers basically stormed into their house and forced them out. They took their belongings and just started throwing it outside of their house. And with guns and stuff, they said, you guys have to leave. They evicted them from their house. So no choice but to leave. And so they set up a little tent on the other side of part of the valley, on the Beit Jala side, a protest tent where they were staying day and night and holding press conferences. And again, as we saw in a lot of these hotspots, there was this beautiful group of Israeli peacemakers, a group of combatants for peace who were staying there with the Casilla family. And there were other activists, Israeli and Palestinian, who were also staying there with them. And they said that they had tried to go back to their house and a big gate had been put up, a new gate, a blue gate with a big blue Star of David on it, so that they could not even get into their property anymore. Now, their property isn't even part of where this new settlement is supposed to be. Like, it isn't even within the boundaries, but it's nearby. And so the settlers are just taking it. So we listened to Alice Casilla. She's a young woman, 30 years old. She's the daughter of the family, and she explained, everything that happened. And then as a group, we prayed, we sang songs, we kind of marched towards the house, a bit. And so we were there to show solidarity and make, learn from what was happening. Shortly after we got back to the States, we saw pictures of Alice all over the internet. She was like getting in a fight basically with a settler because she had tried to go back to her house and the settlers were like attacking her. And she was, kind of standing there, like just trying to make a statement. I cannot get into my own house and my own property. So the Israeli army came and arrested her, not the settlers. They arrested her and her mother and they put them in jail. And Alice was released the next day, but she was given a ban. Like, she cannot go near the property until like mid-October. She can't even go near it or she'll be arrested again, nor is she allowed to speak or give press conferences. She has to be quiet. So, so that was another very, very devastating example. The Casilla family is sort of at the forefront of it, but it's this whole valley. It's this whole Mahrur valley that is going to be cut off from Palestinians. And so the whole community in Bethlehem and Beit Jala and Beit Sahur are devastated. And that's putting it mildly, because they're just trapped now basically in this very heavily populated municipal area. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Bethlehem is almost as densely populated as Gaza, which is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. Because there's no place for them to grow. And so with the cutting off of this last area, it's like Bethlehem is truly becoming a closed up ghetto with no outlets whatsoever.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this story and thinking, what? I don't understand. Like, settlers just showed up and went into the house and threw furniture out and threw people out. That doesn't make sense to me. Like, that can't be. It can be, and it's not. It's not unique. That is an extremely typical story of how Palestinians lose their homes in the West Bank, especially in Area C. It happens in East Jerusalem as well. There are neighborhoods in East Jerusalem where that is the story, and it is a dynamic that is feasible and that becomes more plausible because the IDF protects settlers, even if settlers are violating the law. Right. If settlers are violating a Palestinian's property rights, and the Palestinians resist, the Palestinians are the ones who will be sanctioned for that, for
Yes.
resisting. Yeah, so there's it creates, it goes back to the vulnerability that we're talking about. It makes Palestinians who are experiencing that utterly helpless, which is why international attention and presence and support is sometimes the only thin line between a Palestinian being able to keep their village or their home and a Palestinian becoming a refugee in their own land. So, Mercy, I wanted to ask you about Hebron, and just to kind of frame the question up a little bit for listeners. Hebron is a city in the West Bank. It's a Palestinian city, an ancient city, very important to a lot of different groups in the land. But it's very unique in terms of its relationship to the Israeli occupation, because whereas settlers are typically outside of Palestinian communities, might be very close, but they're outside of. In Hebron, Israeli settlers actually moved into the city and have created urban settlements inside of a Palestinian city, which makes Hebron sometimes one of the most violent, one of the most prone to, a powder keg. Violence is on a hair trigger there. And Palestinians are, in a particularly difficult situation who live in or are from Hebron. So there's, in fact, so this is a picture of one of the market areas. Most of the Palestinian market, the economy there was strangled to death several years ago. So it's a ghost town, but there's a little strip there where Palestinians still have shops. And if you're walking along there, I know this because I was there, and if you look up, you'll see it's stretched. They've stretched chain link, chicken wire, whatever they can find across the top of the market street, creating this kind of protective ceiling, because the Israeli settlement, part of it is in the upper floors of the buildings on this street. So they're that close. They're literally on top of the Palestinians there, and they habitually throw their garbage and refuse out the window down into the Palestinian street. They'll throw bottles of their own urine out, and you look up. I saw bottles with urine sitting up there, and Rob was describing to me before this call how when he walked down that street, it was just putrid smelling. Yeah. For these reasons, it's egregious. So just wanted to give some sense for the situation. And the other layer is, because the settlers are there, just like we were talking about, the Israeli army is there as well. And the fact that all of those groups are in such immediate proximity to each other makes it a very difficult place. So Mercy, I wanted to see what you heard about Hebron while you were there, if you have any updates for us about that.
Yeah, so Hebron was very intense. We went and visited a well-known nonviolent peace activist there called Issa Amro. Both Issa Amro and Daoud Nassar, who we just talked about, they have both been profiled in the New York Times since October 7th as like Gandhis of Palestine, nonviolent activists of Palestine. So they're getting very, very well known. So we went to visit Issa, who lives within the settlement, basically a whole street that was taken over for the settlement. And there are some Palestinians who still live in some of the homes nearby, almost mingled in with the settlement. And the settlers are doing everything they can to try to remove these Palestinians from this area, because they don't want them around. I should say part of the reason Hebron is such a hotspot is because it is where all the patriarchs and matriarchs of ancient Israel are buried. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah. everyone except Rachel, who died outside of Bethlehem. So it's a sacred place for Jewish people, and I understand why they would want to pray there.
And the Muslims too, though, right? Because they're still
Right.
patrons.
And it's
Yeah,
important for Muslims. It's
yeah,
you
yeah.
know, Christians
And Christians,
want to
and
go
Christians,
there
yeah,
and see
yeah.
it. You know, so I don't have like a lack of sympathy for Jewish people
Right.
who want to live in Hebron. I can understand that impulse. It's just the way that this
Yeah.
whole thing is being done is so contrary to anything that represents anything that I think that we understand or know about God, or what Abraham himself would want. I just have to clarify that. When we tried to get into the area where Isa lives, the checkpoint was closed. The only way you can get into this area is to go through checkpoint. There's 2 checkpoints. First one was closed. The soldiers would not let us through. We tried on the other side. The soldiers would not let us through. They said, the settlers will beat you up if you go in there.
Mm.
It's for your own protection. We're not letting you in because the settlers will beat you up. We were like, okay, that's interesting. But we found a way. There was another entrance that someone knew about. So we walked through some back entrance and we made our way to Isa Amro's house. Isa told us, again, he thanked us like Dawood Nassar. He said basically the same thing. Your presence is everything. We are so isolated. He talked about the Palestinians living in this area. He said, we can't get anything we need. Like, you know, if your toilet stops up, you need a plumber. You can't, if you're a Palestinian, you cannot get a plumber to come in and fix. Or if something breaks and you need, you know, someone to come to the house, they can't have any of that. He talked about how difficult it was for them just to get out if people were sick or injured. He said just yesterday, he said, my father needs to go to the hospital from time to time. It took us hours of calling and arranging. And even though the hospital's just right outside and that would take the ambulance like 2 minutes to get here, it took hours and hours. Then he talked about an older woman who some months ago, he said she was very old. She was actually in Hebron from the old days. Her older brother, when he was a baby, he was what you call a milk baby, like with the Jewish families, like they would nurse each other's babies. And there had been a violent uprising against the Jewish people living in Hebron in 1929. This woman's family hid some of the Jews in their house to keep them safe. So here she is now, a very, very, very old woman who'd fallen down and her head was like really damaged. And the family was trying to get her out. Well, you have to coordinate everything through the Israeli military to even have a ambulance come up and get them out through the ambulance. And it took hours and hours and hours. They finally called Isa to help and he intervened and tried, you know, and so he was just using these as examples of saying, people are dying. Like people with acute medical needs are not being able to get to the hospital in time because they're not allowed. The settlers and the army, whatever, they are not allowing it. They're deliberately slowing it down. Like it takes 2 or 3 hours to get an ambulance approved. Then it takes an hour for the ambulance to get there when it's only 2 minutes away. And then it takes another hour or 2 to get the person out through the checkpoint to the ambulance. And if you're in an acute medical emergency, that could be a difference of life or death. Isa himself was kidnapped by the settlers on October 7th, the day that Hamas was launching their attack in Israel. The settlers came wanting, you know, vengeance. And Isa is someone that is easy to pick on because he is bold, he's strong, he speaks up, and he's not intimidated. He's basically the leader of all of the Palestinians living in this area. So they took him, they cuffed him so tight that like his circulation was cut off for 10 hours. They blindfolded him and gagged him and they took him somewhere where then they began beating him. They sexually assaulted him. They were mocking him. You know, they were taking selfies with him. He said it was the 10 hours, the 10 most difficult hours of his life. And he didn't really give like specific details beyond those, what he said. But since he's been released, he's had death threats. Settlers have come up to him and have said, we're watching you. We're going to get you when we can. And he said he said basically speaking as though he's a dead man walking, like he's ready to accept martyrdom. He said, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to keep speaking because this is the right thing to do. We want to live in peace with the Jewish people. We don't want to be at odds with them. This is a land that we can share and we can live together. But it can't be, under one exclusive religion having the dominance and pushing everyone else out. This isn't the way of God, he even said. Earlier, while we were trying to find a way to meet Isa, there was this boy, young teenage boy, who was following us, trying to sell these Palestine bracelets, and he was just unrelenting and like, please buy, And Omar Harami, our leader with Sabil, he said, this young man reminds me of the persistent widow. He finally stopped our group and he said, maybe someone should buy something from him. So we started talking to him, and we found out that he also lived inside the settlement like Isa. And so the boy began telling us how he had also been kidnapped by the soldiers a few months earlier, and he'd also been beat up by them. And that he said that the settlers, it wasn't just the men who did it, but they brought in their children as well. So their sons would, like, the dads would be beating him, and they would teach their sons to also beat him. And the dads would urinate on him, and then they would teach their sons to also urinate on him. And they took all of his things that he was selling, like his little Palestine bracelets and stuff, and they burned them, and then they let him go after a while. So again, it's just this acute vulnerability of these people that are living next to the settlers, who are basically just doing whatever they want and getting away with it. There is no accountability for them, and that's got to change.
Thanks, Mercy. I know that your focus was the West Bank. That was the main purpose for your trip, was to experience some of these places and hear some of these stories and meet some of these people. But I wonder if you did have a chance to meet with any Israelis or hear any of those stories as well.
Yeah. Thank you for asking about that. We really wanted to meet with families of the hostages. There's a group called the Israeli Forum for Missing and Hostages, or something like that. It's up in Tel Aviv. So we were trying to get there, but the road that we were going to take in the West Bank, we were near Ramallah, it was inexplicably closed by the Israeli army. So we had to turn around. That was going to be our shortcut. And we had to take this longer route. And then we got held up at a checkpoint, which took a bit longer. So by the time, and then we got up to Tel Aviv, but there was a big protest going on of hostage families and people like that against the Netanyahu government. So we were stuck in traffic. So by the time we actually got to the place where we were supposed to meet, we were about an hour and a half, 2 hours late, and the families had gone. But the man who sort of runs the organization, he explained to us what they're trying to do is keep the stories of the hostages out in front of the Israeli public, because people are forgetting about them, because they're so focused maybe on a higher priority. Like maybe some of the people are thinking, well, the hostages can be, like, we'd like to get them back, but if we don't, we have a bigger goal here with what we're trying to do in Gaza, which is, get rid of all of Hamas, keep this war going rather than work a hostage deal. So these families were working very hard to try to keep the reality that these hostages are still alive. We need to make a deal. We need to do whatever we can to get them home safely. So as we were talking, I asked him about the families that we would have met. And he said, well, actually, there's one girl right here. Her grandpa is a hostage. He was the oldest hostage. He turned 86 years old in captivity. And so I went over to her and I gave her a hug and I asked her about her grandpa. And she said, everyone that knew him says he was the happiest man that they knew. They don't know if he's still alive or not. If he is, he's 86 years old. So that was very sobering and very painful, as this whole trip was. At the end of our trip, we had a really wonderful opportunity to have an interfaith prayer delegation with a group of rabbis for human rights, one of whom had lived in a kibbutz that was attacked on October 7th, and he survived. and he rarely comes down to that border area near Gaza. His wife can't come back. It's too traumatizing for her. But for him, he comes back. He is still more committed than ever to working for human rights and to bringing an end to the war through justice for Palestinians. So it was this lovely group. And we also had a Muslim sheikh who joined us. And so we were just a few kilometers from the border. You could actually see it in some places from where we were. And we sat and prayed at the site of an ancient Jewish synagogue from the Byzantine era with this beautiful mosaic floor. And as we were praying and singing, you could hear bombs falling in Gaza. Like our prayers, sometimes we would have to stop because like an earth-shattering bomb sound, and then we would resume. And then at one point, an air raid siren went off, and we all laid on our faces or went into the bomb shelter. So we really were like right at the edge. And then the rabbis took us to an area where you could look over and you could actually see like the blackened corpse of the skyline of Khan Yunis. And like to stand right there and to see like these buildings, you know, this jagged skyline of broken buildings, black and gray, just blackened. And to hear the bombs landing there is something that I will never forget. So we had a wonderful time with these Israelis, though. And I want to stress that point because, as I've been repeatedly mentioning, and I want to drive this point home, everywhere we went, there were Israelis who were there showing protective presence. They are a minority, but these people are all the more brave considering the flow of their society right now as a whole. They are really going against the grain. And so I just want to acknowledge them. I want to acknowledge their courage. I want to acknowledge their compassion and their commitment to an ethical vision of what they want represented by their Judaism and by their country. So, so that was also very intense and inspiring in a way. And then after that, we went to an area where a group called Standing Together, again, an Israeli group. This was in the Negev Desert in Israel proper. Standing Together is composed of Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel who are working, standing together. And they were packaging food to be sent into Gaza, and they were all working together. And that was the most cathartic thing I think that we could have done as a way to sort of end our trip, was to join these Palestinians and these Israelis, taping up big boxes of food and getting them loaded up into these big lorries that we hope and pray have made it into Gaza. I don't know, we hope and pray that they made it into Gaza, but all of the food that we were loading had been donated by citizens of Israel, who mostly probably Palestinian citizens, but also Israeli citizens of Israel who cared, who had gone and purchased just piles of, rice and canned foods and all kinds of stuff. There was also a big mountain of stuff that was not allowed into Gaza that people had purchased that had to be set off onto the side. And in there, I noticed like za'atar, I saw candy, chocolate cookies. I saw a lot of forms of soap that is not being allowed into Gaza. But at least we were packaging the food together.
Mercy, thank you so much for just sharing all this with us. As we kind of begin to wrap this up here a little bit, can you kind of share with us a little bit what are the Palestinians saying to us in the West? What are they? You've iterated already that they want internationals to come. They need international presence as well. Obviously, prayer is something we need to do. But what are they saying to us in the West, or even about us in the West?
They're begging us to use our voices, to speak out to our government, to put pressure on our government. They're begging us to come visit. They're begging us to take a position of genuine peacemaking, which includes justice for Palestinians, but also includes helping the two groups live together and not being a greater polarizing force, like I'm for just for this side or just for this side, but for all of the people in the land, recognizing that both of these groups are here and neither one is going to leave. And we need to do everything we can to support both of them to live in peace together. But this includes justice for Palestinians, and this includes holding these settlers accountable. And some of these elements of the Israeli army, they must be held accountable. All of this has been empowered by U.S. Money, by U.S. support. While we were there, Biden is making these statements like, you know, settle down, don't be so violent to the Israelis, while he's sending them another, what did he send? Another 20 billion in weapons. Like while we were there, this happened. There was one branch of the Israeli army that was very, very violent. It's known to have been very, very violent for years. Yeah. And like 2 years ago, maybe, they kidnapped a Palestinian American, a citizen of the USA, who was in Ramallah, an old man who was like in his 70s, close to 80. And they blindfolded him and gagged him, and they stripped him of his clothes, and they beat him up, and they left him outside in the cold in the middle of the night. And it was so then the family, who are also U.S. citizens, appealed to the U.S. government. You need to put sanctions on this unit of the Israeli army. What they're doing, look what they did to a U.S. citizen. Are they going to be held accountable at all? They should not be armed. And the U.S. government was like, okay, we're going to put sanctions on them. But we lifted it on August 9th, the sanctions against this particular unit. It wasn't carried through. So every time we kind of play around with this and we say we're going to put sanctions, or we're going to hold some kind of accountability with how our military funds are spent, and then we don't do anything and we backpedal on it, all it does is embolden the most radical elements within the army and the settlers to do whatever they want, because they perceive that, rightly so, as essentially a hands-off from Washington, D.C. and a green light to go ahead and do whatever they're doing. So our country is directly, personally empowering what is going on. And I would just say, for those who may be listening, who you mainly just care about Israel, maybe you don't even care about Palestinians, Israelis are the ones that you are concerned about. I beg you to consider if this position that our government is taking is helping Israel be safer. Is it helping Israel be the kind of state that it's supposed to be? Or are we acting not like friends, but like enablers? So this is the distillation of what I really took back from all the different Palestinians that we heard. And even Omar, who was leading our trip, he spoke with compassion about some of these young settlers. He said, these boys are teenagers. He said, think of other areas in the world where children are recruited into armies. Like we know of cases in Africa, you know, where they're forced to be in armies and they're kind of brainwashed as teenagers, teenage boys, to go out and do horrific things. And that's a form of child abuse. Yeah. And that's what Omar called it. He said, these Palestinian or these Israeli young settler boys who are doing this are also being abused. They need to be set free as well. I thought that was very beautiful and very compassionate, and also very true. So I would beg people to look at what I shared a lot of things that are really horrific, but I would beg people to look at this with the compassion of the Lord for the healing of Palestine, of Palestinians and Israelis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mercy. I just wrote a blog just yesterday that said if this continues any longer, Israel is in dire jeopardy of existential survival as well. So, Mercy, tell us a little bit about, let's talk some next steps here really quickly as we kind of close. Where can people go, resources, and what can we do, and actions, next steps. So tell us a little bit about the NEME prayer meeting that meets once a month also. So, all right.
If you believe in prayer, as I do, we have a prayer meeting once a month with NEME. It's always on the first day of the month, and you can get the link on the website. It's at 5 p.m. Arizona time, which is Mountain Standard. It's kind of funky. Look into it, but it'll be 5 o'clock tomorrow. Please come and join us for prayer. But also, I will quote Omar again. He was just so quotable. He was like, don't pray if you're not going to do anything. He was very blunt.
That's good.
You know, I'm like, you are so right. You know, so
Yep.
pray, but don't just pray.
Okay.
Prayer alone is not enough. Like, everyone can pray, and we should be praying. But I think we can use our voice in other ways too. And I think now more than ever, with this election that is looming, I think we need to put as much pressure as we can on the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yep.
Whoever your representative is, whatever the party is that you affiliate with, put pressure on them. They need to hear from people of all sectors of society. As an evangelical Christian, I want them to hear from me. So I'm actually planning to go down to Phoenix and talk with my state representatives, and I may even go to DC later this fall, because it is so urgent and it is so pressing, and we need to put the pressure on our government to stop funding this and stop providing diplomatic cover enabling this. It's on us. We have to bring the change.
Amen. Amen. Ben, can you share a little bit about some of the things that NEME has going on? I know we got a live stream coming up on Tuesday. Tell us a little bit about that and some things with NEME.
Yeah, that sounds good. Before I do, I just want to follow up and build on what Mercy said with a very practical place to go to figure out how to approach your elected officials. NEME works very closely with another organization called Churches for Middle East Peace, or CMEP. And they're based in Washington, D.C. They have an advocacy division, and their website is very helpful. If you go to their website, you can find very practical instructions about how to figure out who your elected officials are, and some talking points and ways that you can reach out to them that make it really simple. So, and their website is cmep.org, I think. So
yeah, it's scrolling on the bottom.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. And then as far as NEME is concerned, I'd like to invite you all to another live stream coming up Tuesday that we're hosting. One of the things that NEME is committed to is bearing witness. And that's what tonight's webinar was really all about. We were so pleased that Mercy was able to go and bear witness and then bring that report back to us so that we can bear witness to what's happening in the lives of Israelis and Palestinians. But what's happening on Tuesday is something else that's very important to us as well, which is that we want to be continually examining evangelical biblical interpretations about the Middle East, especially in the ways that it has been used historically to prop up misperceptions about the Middle East and mythologies that we all kind of carry in our heads and hearts about the Middle East that need to be cleared away in order for us to bear witness to what's actually happening in people's lives. And so in order to do that second thing, that's what this webinar is about, specifically about responding to the ways that Christianity Today, which is a flagship evangelical magazine, has taken an editorial approach in the last year to the massive violence in Gaza and to Israel and Palestine that repeats and extends misperceptions. And their coverage has been largely silent on many of the kinds of stories and issues that we talked about tonight.
Right.
And we want to respond to that as NEME, as a community of evangelicals, to talk about what they missed and to fill in some of those gaps. So many of us are regular readers of CT. So it's not a hit job. It's critique in love. A plea with CT to expand the coverage, expand the story, look with a wider lens. So please join us. That's 11 a.m. Pacific time and 2 p.m. Eastern time on Tuesday. And you can register on the NEME website. It would be neme.network/events, and you'll find a link to register for that. Hope to see you there.
Great. Thank you both for joining me here. I've got a Sonoran Desert monsoon brewing out my back patio here that got me distracted for a few minutes. So I apologize for that. I'm like, oh boy. So I had to mute my mic. I don't know if you can hear the wind blowing out right now as it goes as well. But Determined Truth, I wrote a book just for those of you guys that want to look talk about the theological issues called These Brothers of Mine a number of years ago. I have an updated version of that book, a smaller version that should be coming out in the next couple of months. So pay attention for that as well. You can access all the Determined Truth live streams on determinedtruth.com and subscribe to our YouTube page. The Christian Forum on Israel-Palestine, of course, has a live stream actually the hour before the NEME live stream, where we're going to be interviewing David Crump and his book, Like Birds in a Cage. So that's on Tuesday as well. You can get the link for that on the determinedtruth.com homepage there as well. And obviously subscribe to the Christian Forum in Israel-Palestine YouTube page as well. And so we will continue this conversation. We can't stop. We just, we're grieving now. And I think I just want to thank you so much for joining us all. And thank you so much for your time here, Mercy and Ben. Thanks for being with us, everyone.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here. Thanks for listening, everyone.